Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max, and today we're going to be continuing with this series on the shadow and what Carl Jung said about it. So, of course, the shadow is quite a trendy topic in this day and age, a naturally widely misunderstood topic by default because we're talking about something that's unconscious here. But even intellectually, conceptually, there's generally widespread misunderstanding of what the shadow actually is, how it shows up, what to do about it, whether it even exists. I mean, there's widespread understanding of the unconscious more broadly. The unconscious mind is considered merely as a sort of necessary bolt-on to an otherwise materialist model. And so in last week's episode, we looked at what Carl Jung was saying towards the end of his life in the book Aeon, talking about the Christian Aeon and how that sets up the need for a reconciliation of opposites. This was the overarching theme of Jung's entire work, was this concept of wholeness. And today we're going to be doing the opposite, going right back to some of the very first things he said about the shadow, going right back to an essay called On the Psychology of the Unconscious, which is the first of two essays in Collected Works, Volume 7. So this is actually from a similar time to the transcendent function, the essay we discussed a few episodes ago. Imagine Jung is hitting on 40. He's actually just turned 42 by the time this is published. But he's writing it the year before, and he's also basing all of these thoughts on an earlier paper that he wrote in 1912 when he would have been 37. So he's pretty much finished with Freud. He's in the depths of this phase he later called the confrontation with the unconscious. And this is where a lot of the psychology that we have come to know and associate with Jung was really being formed. So I want to bring it back to this essay today because it's always valuable to look at how a concept was conceived of in the first place. It's also useful to look at how it evolved and how it was honed over time. But I think we can fairly say, as I mentioned in the previous episode here, there's still some great contradictions in this concept of the shadow, how it shows up, why it shows up, what to do about it, and not least, is it merely subjective or objective? Is this something that we all just do because we're just silly, ignorant egos who don't know any better? And if so, why is that? And where does the blame lie for that? So there's a lot of questions here. And I keep saying that, Jung was a psychologist. He was very well read in philosophy, and he did do philosophy by any other name, but he did not claim to be a philosopher. And it's very common and not unironic that we like to project things onto Jung, just as we naturally do with any great thinker from history, and often look into their work and see things that aren't necessarily there or aren't necessarily being said. In the case of Jung, he often used terms like the shadow in many, many different ways, especially as he was active for so long, writing prolifically right until the end of his life. So we're going to go right back today to some of his very earliest mentions of this term. I think it can help us understand how it applies today, where maybe it actually falls short today, and how it set the foundations for Jung's later work and his conception of the shadow. So then, this essay, as I mentioned, was originally published in 1917, well into the First World War at this point. But it sounds like he was mostly writing it the year before. Either way, look, it's right in the middle of the First World War. Turns out that was actually a great inspiration for this essay. And one can presume, therefore, also a great manifestation of this very theory of Jung, this concept of the shadow. So I think that's a really important point. The First World War was a great inspiration for Jung's concept of the shadow. And we're going to see why that's relevant as we go forward here. But I'd also just say that there have been several revisions to this, 5 editions. In addition to the first one, there was 1918, still in the First World War, 1926, 1936, and 1943. Obviously, this is going to have great relevance to Jung's conception of shadow. So the aim today is really just to convey and attempt to understand what was his early idea of the shadow and how does that still apply today, and where do we need to not only just take some of Jung's ideas forward, not only understand where that might be helpful, but also understand where actually it maybe ceases to apply in all cases in our modern age. We're going to see where the concept of the shadow falls down and do that in the hope to sort of set the foundations for maybe, as we each must do in our own lives, come to our own full and complete understanding of what this means for us. So let's begin. So in the preface to the first edition, 1916, he said, "The psychological concomitants of the present war are uniquely fitted to force upon the attention of every thinking person the problem of the chaotic unconscious, which slumbers uneasily beneath the ordered world of consciousness." So right off the bat here, he's basically saying that, I don't know about no one, but certainly, hopefully, very few people consciously wanted a First World War to happen. I think what a monumental, in a bad way, event that would have been. The first time there's been a full-scale, multi-nation, mechanized war. He goes on here, "This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian, and has at the same time shown what an iron scourge lies in store for him if ever again he should be tempted to make his neighbour responsible for his own evil." We don't really get a definition of evil from Jung here. We don't really get a full definition of it anywhere, actually. But here he seems to imply that it's standing in contrast to the civilized view of ourselves. Man is still a barbarian, so therefore evil presumably is the uncivilized nature of man. But also that the cause of this event largely seems to be the projection. He hasn't used that word here, but that's essentially what he's saying. The projection of one's own evil, one's own uncivilized nature onto the other. So here he's largely putting it down to the phenomenon of projection. And that seems to be very salient here, because it becomes harder and harder and harder throughout the 20th century to pin it down purely on that phenomena. And it's no less true as we've well into the 21st century now. Can we still honestly say that evil is just our own projection of our own unresolved stuff onto other people, or something we do to others because they don't meet our own preferences? Or, Jung's not really saying that here, but a lot of modern shadow work does seem to take this quite basic idea of the shadow and projection and pretty much extrapolate that into every situation of distrust, displeasure, animosity, any kind of grief, or any kind of gripe anyone has with anyone else. Oh, it's just your own shadow. And the great irony, of course, is that that too is a conscious thesis. That too is a belief that sets up an opposite. And the harder you cling to that belief that everything's just a projection, the more it creates an undeniable, almighty scourge of a shadow that will show up to basically give you no other choice other than to concede to the notion that it might not be only a mere product of your own ignorance or your own inability to deal with your own shadow material. There's nothing one-sided about shadow work. But we're just here to talk about what he was saying at the time. Moving on, preface to the first edition again, he said, "Only a change in the attitude of the individual can initiate a change in the psychology of the nation. If ever there was a time when self-reflection was the absolutely necessary and only right thing, it is now, in our present catastrophic epoch." December 1916. There's never a bad time to do some self-reflection, of course, but what's important here is that Jung is flying the flag for individualism, saying it's got to happen at that level. What the nation does is just the aggregate of what the individuals within it are doing. This is something we have to recognize when doing shadow work, and that there's no one who by themselves can or will take responsibility for the overall direction of the nation. It can only happen in response to the minds of the individuals within it. And this is certainly the case in the Second World War as well, where Hitler obviously being the figurehead of that, but he certainly wasn't alone, and he both represented the unconscious content of the people, and he spoke for their unconscious needs, and he found a way to seemingly placate those challenges that they still felt and the trauma they still carried on to, and so on. But at the same time, their unwillingness to see him as he was led them to do some very evil things as well. So Again, the responsibility lies with each individual and the free choice that we each have. Now, your free choice doesn't preclude the free choice of others, doesn't preclude the free choice of your politicians or your government to do what they're going to do. But as a free acting being, this is what Jung's saying here, you can still respond to that with your own free choice. Government can raise taxes, you can leave the country, right? Might not be a desirable thing to do, but it's the very impositions on your freedom that compel individual sovereignty. Now, you're free to deny that as well. You're free to be free of freedom, but it's still a free choice in which you do that. So let's move on. Second edition, he said, every individual needs revolution, inner division, overthrow of the existing order and renewal, but not by forcing them upon his neighbours under the hypocritical cloak of Christian love or a sense of social responsibility, or any of the other beautiful euphemisms for unconscious urges to personal power. So, where an individual resists transformation, which is understandable because that involves facing up to feeling and resolving tension, there's naturally a resistance to that. We've got by with our current thesis for long enough. Why is it we now have to change it? It's understandable that there's going to be resistance to that. But where one doesn't understand the need for change, dynamic nature of our reality, well, the only possible recourse then is to force others to change. It's to attempt to, under the guise of love or social responsibility, to get the world to adhere to your personal subjective preferences and ways of being and beliefs. So where that process isn't embraced and where the individual resists change, and the entire country is doing that, the only place that can go is the attempt to get others to change and adhere to their personal preferences. Now, we can't all be doing that. Of course, where that's happening, you get conflict, and where no one's willing to transform or change, things magnify, things blow up. You might get a war. But again, we're seeing some interesting use of wording here about this unconscious urges to personal power. Yeah, kinda. But you could also argue that the desire to this cloak of Christian love or social responsibility, that is power. It's just under a different name. That's kind of what Jung is saying here, is that there's this tendency to hide from ourselves the desire for power. Because to an extent, power is just will. It's just a perfectly natural, healthy use of the mind, use of will to carry out a thesis, to make things a certain way, to realize something, to bring something into existence, to form something, to connect something. But it's when that becomes one-sided and we fall in love with just that idea and say, okay, that's the way, that's how it has to be, that's when it arguably becomes power in the egocentric sense. Power at the expense of other people's freedom. That's when it becomes malignant. That's when it becomes toxic, self-contradictory, and unsustainable. And the easiest, most expedient way to deal with that is to say, oh, it's not power, it's love. I'm not being selfish, it's social responsibility. And these ideas, of course, contain their own contradiction. If you want to be really, really, really loving and go around telling other people what's best for them and so on, under the guise of helping them, you're actually not helping them at all. You're buying into a power shadow dynamic whereby you get to be the exalted wise one, and they get to be the oh so needy victims who only have a good life now because of your ostensible love. And that's actually no good for anybody. Presumably whoever's going about carrying out that kind of ideology doesn't actually want the thing that they're giving to their people who they're supposedly helping. They don't want to be in that position. They want to be the one who gets to help them, not the one who gets helped. So that should tell you everything you need to know about the true feelings and hypocrisy that's at the heart of these kinds of movements. But in essence, what he's saying here is there needs to be revolution. We need to overthrow the existing order, but not literally going out and overthrowing other people, other nations, but doing it internally. And even then, not as a matter of inner war, but as an inner dialectic, not where one part of us completely breaks down and we risk our very livelihood or our life itself because of just inordinate amounts of inner resistance. And he's saying open up a dialogue, work with both sides, honor both sides, the eros, the thanatos. the power of love, but also the will to power. Okay, let's move on. Now, 1925, preface to the third edition, he said, this book was written during the World War, and it owes its existence primarily to the psychological repercussions of that great event. Now that the war is over, the great psychological problems that the war threw up still occupy the mind and hearts of every thinking and feeling person. Not sounding good, is it? All right. Now, moving on to the fifth edition, April 1942, he said, new ideas, if they're not just a flash in the pan, generally require at least a generation to take root. Psychological innovations probably take much longer, since in this field, more than in any other, practically everybody sets himself up as an authority. So they should. Everyone's a psychologist. Everyone has to be a psychologist. The mind, or at least our mind, is something that we all know. And there's a very good case to say that, well, that's our whole purpose here, is to know ourselves and to know our mind and to understand the mind and the nature of things. And everything we do leads us back to that central hub, ultimately. This is very Jungian. What he doesn't mention here, interestingly, in 1942, is the Second World War. Now, of course, he mentioned it in many, many other places as well. But I think that's particularly interesting because at the same time, you're seeing Jung's discussion of evil more broadly and also the shadow changing a little bit. So we're going to get there as well, but just wanted to make that point that he doesn't actually mention it. So the very essay that was rooted in World War I, and then in 1925, he's saying, yeah, the problem hasn't really disappeared. Another Second World War later, and it sounds almost slightly despondent. So let's get on to the essay itself. He said, there are, in a neurosis, two tendencies standing in strict opposition to one another, one of which is unconscious. That's it. So simple, right? That is Jungian psychology in a nutshell. Obviously, there's quite a lot left out of that, but that is actually, in a Jungian sense, that's the cause of the problem. It's conflict. It's that there are incompatible tendencies, inclinations, desires, beliefs, whatever it might be. It's a matter of energy. And it's happened that way because existence is an unfolding, and our own existence is a microcosm of that. We learn to be a certain way in early life. We attach a moral value to certain ways of being and push out opposite ways of being. And that seems to get us by. We go out into life, we go forth, we try and make things a certain way. We try and set up a comfortable life for ourselves. And we get all the approval from that we crave since childhood. And we shut off the whole other side of life. As Jung goes on, neurosis is self-division. In most people, the cause of the division is that the conscious mind wants to hang on to its moral ideal, while the unconscious strives after its, in a contemporary sense, unmoral ideal, which the conscious mind tries to deny. Yeah, so we're seeing this early understanding of shadow and what evil is and why it comes about, and pinning it largely on the fact that the conscious mind just has a moral ideal. It has to, in order to go anywhere, in order to survive, in order to get parental approval or whatever it might be. From a psychological standpoint, it's that the mind has learned to be a certain way. You can think about this in terms of cognitive functions. You can think about this in terms of symbols, like star signs if you want, or however you want to think of it, masculine, feminine, and it leaves behind the opposite. And that polarity actually brings about the opposite. It's still there. It must provide a counterbalance. But consciously, we want to be one way and see the opposite way as unmoral, and therefore the conscious mind tries to deny it. We talked about the mechanism of this in greater depth in the series on the transcendent function, so go check that out if you haven't done already. He refers to this as like the directedness of mind. So the mind goes out, it sees things a certain way in terms of itself, in terms of what it knows, and then it extrapolates that into everything it doesn't know. And so it tends to blank that out and see it only in terms of what it knows. But then it must necessarily come up against the conflict brought about by the unconscious side of things. So we can talk about this till the cows come home. None of that actually is the work. I mean, you need to understand it in order to do the work, but it very much helps to understand what's actually going on here for the work to in any way be successful. But the work is actually done in the energy exchange that goes on when the conscious encounters the unconscious. Let's move on. So in this essay overall, Jung is looking at the existing theories at the time for explaining neurosis and the motivations behind the unconscious mind, where that comes from. He's looking at two of the dominant theories at the time. So Freud and Adler. So in regards to Freud, thinking that it's largely about eros, so repressed sexual drive, and how this leads to neurosis. But on the other hand, Adler and the will to power and the desire for independence and to break free. So what Jung is saying here is actually that either of those can appear true from the perspective of someone for whom that is their belief and their way of operating. So Freud maybe saw it his way because that was true enough in Freud's case. Adler saw it his way for the same reason, but they disagreed with each other. And Jung is essentially coming in and attempting a synthesis of these two and saying, well, it can be one, it can be the other. And why is that? It's coming to understand that, well, it depends on who the person is, and depends on, therefore, what they've developed and made conscious as part of their upbringing, and what they've left behind as part of their psychic template. Just as our body has a certain form, our psyche has a certain template, and there's certain aspects of it that exist that we simply cannot just put to one side and forget about. So in regards to Freud's theory, he said, as already observed, this shadow side of the psyche, being withdrawn from conscious scrutiny, cannot be dealt with by the patient. He cannot correct it, cannot come to terms with it, nor yet disregard it. For in reality, he does not possess the unconscious impulses at all. So as much as he's referring to Freud here, this equally applies to Jung's own theories and any theory actually about neurosis and the unconscious. It's the same idea. The neurotic in this case, that's all of us. He cannot come to terms with it because he does not possess it. It's not his, not consciously. It's coming from his mind, aspects of the unconscious mind, perhaps the wider collective unconscious too. Jung's not talking about that yet. But this is possibly the very first mention of shadow by Jung, this shadow side of the psyche. I think it's useful to think back symbolically, what is a shadow? Right? Literally, what causes shadow? If you shine a light on an object, there's an absence of light on the other side. Simple, right? So to truly know an object, you cannot simply look at it from one side. It creates a shadow. In the case of our personalities, if we only make conscious one side of ourselves, it creates a shadow in the other side. In order to become who we really are, to become whole and realize that psychic template and potential, we have to shine a light on both sides. So this is very useful, I think, because the word shadow, practically speaking, can come to mean many, many different things. James Hollis described it as that which renders us uncomfortable in confronting ourselves. But that could also be your very conscious attachment to how it is you like to show up, whether that's someone who's a great host, a great caregiver, whether that's someone who's a great sage, very wise and very intelligent, however you like to think about yourself, however it is that you get by and get things done. If someone said to you, oh, you like to think you're really intelligent, well, and you say, no, I don't, that's not fair, that's not true. Would that be shadow? You see, so there's nuance here. But from what Jung is saying and just the very idea of the shadow, I think we do well to get very precise about what we mean here. And why not go right back to the initial inspiration? Because we know how much Jung loved symbols. He's using the symbol of the shadow. He wasn't the first, because the shadow is an archetype. It's existed probably for hundreds of thousands of years. But what does that mean? Well, it's the other side that's unknown by virtue of the fact that one side is being lit up, is being made conscious. So then, he goes on, there are patients who boast that for them, the shadow side does not exist. They assure us that they have no conflict, but they do not see that other things of unknown origin cumber their path. Hysterical moods, underhand tricks which they play on themselves and their neighbors, a nervous catarrh of the stomach, pains in various places, irritability for no reason, and a whole host of nervous symptoms. So naturally, the shadow being unconscious is not easy to see. And the conscious mind has a way of rendering experience in such a way that it tends to make sense. That's what it does, because it's perceiving everything, not only perceiving, but crafting everything in terms of what it knows. But that energetic pole in the shadow must also bring its reality about as well. And when that appears, it must necessarily appear externally, because as far as the mind is concerned, it's not something that belongs to it. And this doesn't mean that it's just out there and you're just imagining it outside and all of this stuff. This is where things get a bit esoteric. And I think this is an area where maybe Jung's psychology doesn't explicitly address, at least not enough, the reality of what might be happening out there. And furthermore, does it help? And does it fix the problem to regard it purely as a so-called projection or a manifestation of something inside oneself? In some cases, yes. And actually, maybe that's, well, I'm going to make the case that I think that has served a pretty crucial purpose for a very long time. And yet that it itself is a belief that sets up an opposite. And that's a large part of arguably why we had World War II and why it's touch and go as to whether we've really learned from that and can make conscious the real meaning of that all. So we're going to get there too. But he goes on, if people can be educated to see the shadow side of their nature clearly, it may be hoped that they will also learn to understand and love their fellow men better. A little less hypocrisy and a little more self-knowledge could only have good results in respect for our neighbour, for we are all too prone to transfer to our fellows the injustice and violence we inflict upon our own natures. So again, like with all of these quotes, I think there's truth and utility in all of them that can take us to a point, right? But I think Jung himself would also have acknowledged that none of it is true in an absolute sense. So for example, seeing our own shadow in Marie-Louise von Franz's work, she makes the point that actually seeing your own shadow can help you see evil more clearly in the world. Doesn't necessarily mean that you don't love your fellow men, but let's be clear here that actually sometimes seeing evil in the world is a product of seeing it clearly. Sometimes it's a product of projection. But the reverse is also true in that, in other words, seeing goodness in the world can also be a product of projection. Equally so. Is there any reason to think it's any less so? So again, I think what we're seeing here is a snapshot of Jung's thoughts on projection and putting a slant on them that is very much about understanding where you might be seeing your own evil in the world. This is a huge part of shadow work, and not just individual shadow work, but this is a huge part of, we see it clear as day right now with the US and Russia, or the West and Russia. We see it in Western news, we see it in Russian communications, right? It's pretty clear as day. Difference today, however, is that, I don't know about you, but the perception I have is that the vast majority of people, of civilians down on the ground, doing their thing, going about their days, they have no interest, most of them, in getting caught up in any kind of conflict. They don't see it in quite the same way as our great-great-grandparents today would have done back in 1914 and 1939. So the people that are running this thing at the top, they're not thinking in terms of, okay, what's absolute evil here? What's the difference between my subjective perception and the objective existence of evil? And they're just thinking, oh, you know, this other person is evil, and then they're doing all those same things themselves. But that's not enough. We have to go way beyond that. Because even in this quote here, we're seeing the sort of, look, if we can just all love each other, then everything will be great, right? And yeah, like that at a point, that's really necessary. But that too sets up a shadow. And that then puts us face to face with the question of, well, okay, well, if religion cannot adequately define what evil is, or if it seems that it can, what about the other religion that disagrees? What are we going to do about that? Well, okay, so Nietzsche comes in, God is dead. We have to set up our own values. And then it's like, well, does that mean that everyone's values are equal? Because if we're setting them up and it's just our own preferences, and what are they grounded in? If it's not religion, if it's not God, then what is it? And has that taken us anywhere good? And so therefore, what's the answer? how do we synthesize those two things? Well, it's most unfortunate, in my opinion, that a lot of the thinking around this from the 18th century and early 19th century, especially the idealist philosophers, was largely misunderstood, largely pushed aside and forgotten about. You might have heard of Hegel, you've probably heard of Kant, Fichte and Schelling, people like this. They had very, very intricate ideas around the nature of evil and morality and freedom. Not to say that any of them necessarily solve that mystery, because there's always going to be mystery, but they made some very, very great progress in that area. And because they were all German, and other reasons too, but World War II did not help. These were a group of geniuses that made probably the best philosophical inquiry into the nature of morality that we have. And that's an opinion, but we do very well to go back and learn from these guys, because they have what we need to at least synthesize this current predicament that we're in. And on one hand, that there's basically no such thing as an absolute morality. And on the other hand, that there has to be some kind of morality, because the proof is in the pudding. When we act as though there isn't, things are horribly wrong. And we feel the results of that through the very quality of our lives. You walk down the street, it's covered in litter and graffiti. What's that about? Where is that coming from? Why is that happening? And yet, for all that said, Jung was very, very astute to be saying this at that time. It was the most astute, because he was talking about this phenomenon of projection, which maybe I should do another video in the future, what Jung said about projection, because that's a very tricky one as well. Because projection, even though it's taught as an unconscious phenomenon, in the psychological sense, yes, we project what's unconscious, but on a more metaphysical level, is it necessarily only unconscious things that we project? Is it not also conscious things that we project? Am I not seeing the world in terms of how I consciously understand it? And beyond that, am I only seeing negative qualities in the other? Do I not get some benefit in seeing wholesome qualities in the other? And how accurate is that? It's very well understood in Jungian psychology that we tend to project archetypes onto experience, including things like the self, or Christ, or God, or the medicine man. And there's certain advantages and disadvantages to that. And you take that to its extreme, and that becomes a train wreck. So clearly projection isn't just to do with what we deem to be negative phenomena or qualities. And lastly, the intention with which it's done. Is it necessarily a defense mechanism to see aspects of yourself in the world? Can that be done also with wholesome intentions? Might we be projecting with a view to attain greater self-knowledge? And can we very quickly become aware that that is in fact what we're doing? Just as we can also project with unwholesome intentions, we can try to deflect attention away from ourselves, criticism away from ourselves, and knowingly or not, because this sort of fear and this concern that actually we might be the one who's being selfish, let's say, is pre-conscious right below the threshold. The mind is just working with whatever jigsaw puzzle pieces it has and says, you're being selfish. So there's a whole concoction of ingredients there to figure out. And I actually do this in my course, Inner Shadow Work. I talk about how I think there is actually 8 kinds of projection based on those various variables I just threw out. So I go into some depth into it there, and there's certainly more to be said as well. But what Jung was saying here is very relevant to the time, but it needs to be carried through into today's world. So let's move on. He said, the personal unconscious contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, i.e. forgotten on purpose, subliminal perceptions, by which I meant sense perceptions that were not strong enough to reach consciousness, and finally, contents that are not yet ripe for consciousness. I'll just pause there. So this is just a very brief summary of what's in the personal unconscious. So the shadow is part of the personal unconscious, but generally you wouldn't say that the personal unconscious was the shadow, because it contains all this other stuff as well. Things that are not yet ripe for consciousness. That implies these aren't things that we've merely repressed. These are just aspects of our implicit order that haven't been able to come to the surface yet. But it also does include things that were repressed and sense perceptions. But he then goes on, it corresponds to the figure of the shadow so frequently met with in dreams. And then interestingly, there's a footnote here. So he defines and elaborates on what he means by shadow here. He says, by shadow, I mean the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, together with the insufficiently developed functions and the contents of the personal unconscious. So this is a little confusing because it sort of sounds like he's saying the shadow includes personal unconscious. And I think symbolically, there's a great deal of overlap there because the unconscious can show up in all kinds of ways. A shadow figure, a dark room, a cellar or basement, an ocean, a lake. So all these different ways of concealing a dark room, like turning the light off in a room, a cave. Yeah, okay, you get the idea. But the shadow here, he's saying he means the negative side of the personality, qualities we like to hide, together with insufficiently developed functions. So there's several ways in which this can show up, and I would say these are quite distinct ways. The first would be the simple opposite of how we like to show up. And I would make the case that this is the most accurate use of the word shadow. This is, I would say, going back to that image of shining a light on an object, what's on the other side? If you bring to light, say, your caregiving tendencies, or your logical thinking tendencies, or your tendencies to be very pragmatic and efficient, what is necessarily left out in giving energy to those aspects and awareness to those aspects? So this would be the opposite of how we like to show up. And that is not inherently good or bad, as it were, or wholesome or unwholesome, or loving or evil. So that'd be the first way. But there's another slightly different meaning here, which is, I mentioned it earlier, where it's just simply anything we don't like. So that could even be the very way we do show up, but the negative form of it. So this is another very, very common understanding of the word shadow, is that it's just simply that which is so-called evil. But what does that mean? This is why I mentioned the idealist philosophers earlier, because they really thought about this. They had a very good thesis, collection of theses around what evil actually is and what it means. And I think we do very well at this particular moment in time to really delve into that and develop a better understanding of what evil actually is. Because we don't, it just shows up, and that's how we get to know it. It's just, well, I know what it is now because I'm seeing it in the world, right? But anyway, so it's like, what is the shadow? Is it the opposite? Because people also talk about the light shadow. Oh, the shadow is not inherently bad and so on. Or is it? Because in other cases, it's discussed as though it's actually just the evil side. Even though we don't really have a definition for evil, it's just that side we deem as bad or don't like. And that's not necessarily the opposite. That just might be the person who likes to be logical has become so logical that people are ostracizing them because they just want to be right about everything and they keep correcting people. And it has a very, dare I say, negative side. So this alludes to a whole other dimension here, which is around intention, and I refer to it as direction. So you've got the quantity, so the magnitude of the energy, how much energy is actually behind this movement, how logical are you, how much do you need to be that? You've got the quality, which is, well, is it logic, is it caregiving, is it efficiency, is it sensitivity, what is the actual quality, what flavor is that showing up as? Then you've also got direction. You've got, well, what is this being used for? Is it serving wholeness? Is it used with the intention to interface with the unconscious, to reconcile with it? Is it being used for ends that honor freedom? Or is it in violation of all that stuff? Is it self-contradictory? Is it insisting on the alienated self? So there's a whole other dimension here. And I think we struggle to understand what that could even mean to be evil, because, well, philosophically, we've gone from relying on divine doctrine and then that being called into question to then throwing all those values out and then kind of being left without really knowing what to do with it all, putting it into practice and realizing that it too has an almighty dark side. So I have a thesis here, which is that Jung's own very understanding of shadow and evil was marked by the two world wars. So the First World War really, if it didn't introduce the idea, it certainly catalyzed this early writing of Jung, and this shadow in this very personal, subjective form, and that humans do have a tendency to see their own misgivings in others. And this can be the result of just showing up and encountering a different culture or a different way of doing things. And if you've come from a place where you do things your way and they do their things their way, that can be enough to incite that shadow material. Doesn't mean it's evil, right? But beyond that, like, is it simply that everyone is just essentially good? We just misunderstand each other. Jung wasn't saying that, but I think it was necessary that this First World War and that period of his life and his own shadow work led to an understanding of the shadow in this very subjective sense. But by the time the Second World War came around, I think it was the case that he could probably, and probably a million other people who were having similar thoughts at the time, can we really pin this on just our own shadow material from our own personal unconscious? I'm going to jump to the last slide because it's relevant to this, and then we'll come back. Jung said, when somebody projects the devil upon his neighbor, he does so because this person has something about him which makes the attachment of such an image possible. All right, so it's like the hook for the projection. It may not be literally true, but he sees it nonetheless because it fits his current thesis. So he goes on, but this is not to say that man is on that account a devil. On the contrary, he may be a particularly good fellow, but antipathetic to the maker of the projection, so that a devilish, i.e. dividing effect arises between them. Nor need the projector necessarily be a devil, although he has to recognize that he has something just as devilish in himself and has only stumbled upon it by projecting it. But that does not make him a devil. Indeed, he may be just as decent as the other man. The appearance of the devil in such a case simply means that the two people are at present incompatible, for which reason the unconscious forces them apart and keeps them away from each other. So on that, arguably, by the same token, it also brings them together so that they can each encounter their own shadow material. Now, what would it mean to be a particularly good fellow? And who would be the judge of that? And how would we decide? How do we know that we're seeing things objectively there? And this was written pre-World War II. Begs the question, was Hitler a particularly good fellow? Was it just the result of others projecting their badness onto him? What about the goodness that the German people projected onto him? He himself, multifaceted, right? Evil doesn't look like evil, as the saying goes. So there's a lot of value in what he's saying here, but we should take it for the value that it contains and no more. That's what I'm saying. Take it as far as we need to understand the truth in it, but be very careful of, in exactly the same way, projecting it into our experience and assuming that all experience can be explained in terms of it. That's exactly what we tend to do with our minds. That is this directedness of mind in action. So he goes on just to clarify, the devil is a variant of the shadow archetype, i.e. of the dangerous aspect of the unrecognized dark half of the personality. Yeah, the unrecognized dark half of the personality, that corroborates the idea that the shadow is best considered the opposite, not merely that which is so-called evil or that which we don't like, but that which is the opposite. And maybe we need other terms to explain those other things. And so I have a model that includes all of that. I'm going to be making more content on that, particularly in the Know Yourself program in time. But yes, the shadow work courses are very nearly live. If you're interested, register at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. Just put your email into the form there and you will be notified as soon as they go live. So then, I want to jump back a slide because we missed one. This is very noteworthy. So this idea of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to become their opposites. So Jung said, old Heraclitus discovered the most marvelous of all psychological laws, the regulative function of opposites. He called it enantiodromia, a running contrariwise, by which he meant that sooner or later, everything runs into its opposite. That is the foundation of shadow work. And this is a phenomena, this is a law of nature, if you like, that is at the core of our culture's fundamental misunderstanding of what there is. Because materialism and material science, as useful as that has been, and as necessary as it is to model the world, it doesn't explain existence. And this very notion that things run into their opposite, why is that? We'll get into metaphysical territory there. We can get pretty far just by understanding, well, that is how it is. Don't know why that is, but okay, I get that. I see how that plays out in my life and in the world. I think we need to go a bit deeper than that ultimately. And so why is this happening? Because it cuts to the very heart of existence itself. And this is where the idealists like Hegel, like Schelling, had a lot to say that pertains to this, about the rational nature of the universe. Doesn't mean that the universe is like, a thinking type. It has nothing to do with that. It means that, well, the way I think about it is that it all checks out in the end. It's that ideas contain their own contradiction because they leave something out. And that the very essence of experience is non-contradictoriness or freedom. So anything is possible, but by the very same token, you cannot have contradiction because that would defy the very thing that was ostensibly possible in the first place. In other words, if I want to be free, that also sets up limitation. It's necessary for the very truth of freedom that also sets up limitation. It wouldn't be free if it didn't contain limitation. It wouldn't be life if it didn't contain death. There wouldn't be up if there wasn't down. It simply isn't possible. So, he goes on, thus, the rational attitude of culture necessarily runs into its opposite, namely the irrational devastation of culture. We should never identify ourselves with reason, for man is not and never will be a creature of reason alone, a fact to be noted by all pedantic culture-mongers. So then, thank you for your time and attention. Just to say, yes, the Know Yourself program is reaching its next phase. Courses 1 and 2 are already live. The Making Conscious Philosophy is only $7, so it's same quality as the other courses. I just wanted to make it very accessible at low price points. Inner shadow work and outer shadow work will be released by the time my next video goes live. I'll make sure of it. I'm very, very close to having those live. Then there's going to be a bit of a break, and hopefully the final course should be live before the end of the year, probably the last week of December for that one. So, thanks again. If you found that useful, and I shall see you in the next one.